So staying with the toolbox, we have to worry about chronic and acute climate stresses, as we know. So preparedness and prevention against shocks then can be very critical. So here we'll look at a figure which illustrates how when shocks are more intense and less frequent, prevention becomes less affordable and preparedness becomes more important, so that you are not going to prepare for all the shocks, but you will have the system in place that God forbid you get hit by the shock, then you will quickly recover and you have the preparedness to deal with the shocks. Okay, not all countries can aspire to the same level of resilience over the short term. Defining risk levels should also consider ethical issues, poverty reduction, and inequality objectives, so that you are not protecting one segment of the society, which often tends to happen. For example, if there are floods in Mumbai, are the flood prevention efforts taking care of all the people, all neighborhoods, without worrying about their socioeconomic status? That's not always guaranteed, so one has to watch out for, especially when you are making adaptation, which are changes in the infrastructure, where the roads go, what the bridges connect, where the drainage goes, and so on and so forth. So figure K3 then, prevention and preparedness efforts and how they depend on income levels. So you are going here at starting in the intensity increase and frequency decrease scale here. So the return period decreases, but return period increases, but the intensity of the shock increases. And on this scale you have 0% in prevention, 100% in preparedness, so that you are not trying to prevent shocks, but just making sure that you are prepared to deal with them. So the economic option is made in this way. 100% in prevention and 0% in preparedness, so you are just thinking you will just avoid the shock, and so you don't have to be prepared to deal with anything. Okay, so here as countries grow richer, they spend more on prevention, so the need for coping and recovery decreases. So it could be the seawall that we talked about, or building codes to manage hurricane impacts, wind impacts, and so on and so forth. For small and frequent shocks, impacts are unacceptable and focus should be on prevention. So if shocks are very frequent and small, impacts can be unacceptable, and the focus will have to be on preventing these frequent shocks and not just wait. There is no preparedness to repeatedly respond to these small but frequent shocks. Okay, on this end we have for large and infrequent shocks, prevention is too costly, and the focus should be on coping and recovering with minimum long-term impact on the growth and well-being. These are critical things which most climate scientists don't necessarily think about, so social scientists have to tell us this is how choices will have to be made. So if we keep producing climate information without knowing what aspects of decision making are important in terms of tailoring the information for decision makers, then will not be very effective. Okay, so countries with different institutional and technical capacities and levels of wealth will not select the same level of acceptable risk, obvious, right? So while the Netherlands has invested massively in coastal protection to reduce flood risks to almost zero, this solution may remain unaffordable for many developing countries in the next decades. Poor countries often experience repeated shocks. For example, urban floods affect Dar es Salaam in Tanzania almost every year, and drought-related crop losses occur every few years across Eastern Africa. In India, for example, Mumbai faces floods all the time, but the preparedness has been increased so much that loss of life is reduced, but other impacts, socioeconomic activities, and who gets affected, which class of the workers get affected by failures of transportation systems and so on. So it all is always complicated. The frequency of disaster and climate-related impacts in these countries means that preparedness through early warning systems and other mechanisms has to play a bigger role than it does in rich countries. So country like India, one of the best adaptation tools is an early warning system, because monsoon extremes, droughts in some places like eastern Maharashtra, or cyclones, they are not some things you can control. So prevention is just not possible. So preparedness is pretty much the only option. And then early warnings become one of the best adaptive tools, and India has fortunately invested a lot in that and getting better and better at the skill of early warnings, as we saw with Cyclone Biparjoy, where only 2 people died. This, more than 50,000 were evacuated. Of course, there are economic damages that follow. Once an acceptable level of risk has been defined, it can guide investment decisions, funding the required actions to maintain residual risk below this acceptable level. This is the approach the Netherlands government uses to manage flooding. It commits to maintain risk below certain levels, depending on population density, and then translate these commitments into all investment plans. But there people are told what the government has provided protection against, what level of flooding and sea level rise, etc. Then peoples and firms are responsible beyond that in the residual risk part. So small, homogeneous, rich countries like Netherlands can do this, and they recognize the threat of sea level rise as an imminent and critical risk for themselves, so they obviously have invested in dealing with it. In the presence of significant interdependencies across systems, applying a consistent level of resilience to various components of the infrastructure system is more cost effective than making independent decisions. So infrastructure system level resilience decisions have to be made so that the entire system and the network remains resilient, because if you improve roads in one place and all the connected highways are not protected or given the same level of resilience, then the system can quickly fail, right? It would not make sense for a government to invest major resources in making the power system highly resilient if the water supply or transport system cannot cope with frequent hazards. So here multiple components are connected to producing energy, and they all have to be resilient and cope with shocks and hazards. For systems that interact, it's more practical and efficient to use target level of resilience to allocate investments across sectors than trying to equalize the rate of return of various investments. So you will have to then make it not so much about rate of returns or cost benefit analysis, but go for resilience as a fundamental deliverable. Moving to dedicated metrics to capture the distributional impacts, economic losses hide the impact of disasters on poor people. This is always tricky. Climate change is not gender neutral, it's not equitable. It's going to hit unequally to people based on their vulnerabilities. Because the wealthy have more assets and income to lose, their interests dominate economic loss assessments. This was unfortunate, but this is what happens. And now even when AI is being used on, let's say, the data that includes rich and poor people, there are implicit biases that creep into the AI analysis as well, which can be very tricky. If informed only by potential economic losses, decisions about the resilience of infrastructure or investments to reduce natural risks will tend to favor a country's or a city's richest areas. Although the poor often have little to lose, they lack the resources and tools to cope with infrastructure disruptions or income shocks without reducing essential consumption. So economy gets affected, and their own well-being, which is not always a market good, right? So they are more likely than the wealthy to forgo food, health services, and education after a disaster, which can have long-lasting impacts as well. If children are not educated, they may end up getting trapped in poverty again. To ensure resilience is distributed fairly across the population, governments can use a metric that accounts for the socio-economic status of affected populations to measure the impact of disasters and infrastructure disruptions. A recent analysis in the Philippines employed a multi-metric and regional level assessment of disaster risks using traditional asset losses, poverty-related measures such as poverty headcount, well-being losses for a balanced estimate of the impact on poor and rich households. So well-being can be used as a metric for all. The factors that affect the well-being may be very different. Loss of power and AC may be much more of a well-being impact on the rich, but just basic availability of food may be impact on well-being for the poor, right? So and socioeconomic resilience to measure the population's ability. So we are talking about, analysis in the Philippines, which also included socioeconomic resilience to measure the population's ability to cope with and recover from asset losses. Could be fisherman's boat, house, could be school for the kids, and so on. In both spatial, where to act, and sectoral, how to act terms, priority interventions depend on the metric used for disaster severity. Focusing on physical asset risks prioritizes adaptation actions in areas with high asset values and strong economic activity, while concentrating on well-being losses prioritizes actions in poor and vulnerable areas. So this is very important to remember. In the Philippines, for example, if asset losses are the main measure of disaster impact, the most important intervention will take place in the Manila area. If the government expresses its policy objectives in terms of poverty incidence and well-being losses, then the regions become priorities. So we'll look at this in figure K4. But countries need to account for multiple policy objectives when assessing national risks. It's not a one silver bullet kind of approach for all risks at all scales in time and space. As such, they should use a set of metrics that goes beyond asset losses, obviously. So looking at figure K4, using different metrics to measure natural risks in the Philippines highlights the different intervention priorities. So here risks are not complete in the sense of hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and response. So just be aware of that. Annual asset risk. So here, multi-hazard asset risk, you can see here national total PHP of 72 billion. Number of people falling into poverty each year. So this is annual consumption, poverty increase as percentage of regional population. National total of 0.5% of the total. So you can see the maps light up very different regions. Of course, the scales are different, but nonetheless, you get the idea of how things change when you look at annual asset risk versus number of people falling into poverty each year. Let me stop here for a second. I have to take care of something. Okay, sorry about that. I had to run off and take care of something. So here we are dealing with using different metrics to measure natural risks in the Philippines, highlighting different intervention priorities. So here we are talking about amount of investments in Philippine pesos, 72 billions if you focus on annual asset risk. Number of people falling into poverty each year, you have the total number of population that's going to get exposed. Annual well-being risk, again you can see these overlap much more than these three do. So this is well-being losses again in Philippine pesos per year. So that's national total of Philippine pesos 167 billion. And if you focus on socioeconomic resilience as a priority, a metric to measure natural risks in the Philippines, then you end up with very different regions down here which don't jump out here at all. So socioeconomic resilience in terms of percentage, the national average is 43% here. So you can see these are very low in the scale of socioeconomic resilience, and these regions are much higher, which shows up here as annual asset risk as well, because rich people tend to have more assets to lose and so on. Okay, so I will stop this here and come back and look at the COVID-19 impact as a spotlight about developing a stimulus and recovery package that builds resilience in this context of prioritizing, implementing, and monitoring progress. We have looked at it in other priority areas as well. And remembering again, this was written before the COVID, so the information is useful to look at to see what they were saying about COVID-19 and what in fact transpired since we have now lived through the COVID pandemic and hopefully completely out of it. Okay, see you in the next podcast.